Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, 1776 to 1963, and Survival of the Richest, Donald Jeffries separates the real from the unreal. Fact from fiction. Reverse engineering our manufactured reality. And now, from just outside the swamp-infested Washington, D.C., this is I Protest with Donald Jeffries.
And welcome to I Protest. This is Donald Jeffries here with you, as the man says, coming to you from just outside the swamp infested in Washington, D.C. We do this every Friday from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern. Very distinguished guest today. David Beito is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Alabama and is a research fellow at the Independent Institute. He's written several books. We're going to mainly discuss his most recent book, which is The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights, the untold story of FDR's concentration camps, censorship, and mass surveillance. David, I'm just fascinated by this, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's my pleasure. So, first of all, to explain something about you, I'm a populist, but I originally came from the left. I was a card-carrying member of the ACLU way back when, as a teenager in the 70s, when I was working for Mark Lane as a volunteer in the Citizens Committee of Inquiry. And so I'm still on the classical left, kind of, but, I'm also far right-wing on some issues now because the left is so different. So how did you, I'm still a Kennedy fanboy, but I've not been a fan of FDR for a long time, and it's mainly because of the stuff you have in your book. He was just, I think, an awful fellow, going back to when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But what caused you, because I get the impression that you're probably a liberal, or were a liberal too, when I'm reading what you wrote. So what made you decide to write this book, and how did you anger a lot of your fellow professors?
That's a good question. I've read some literature that's critical of FDR and his failure to get us out of the Great Depression. People like Bert Folsom and others, and so I thought his reputation was overinflated. But then I just started to read more about FDR, and I just said, this guy he's not a very attractive human being in a lot of ways. And there's this incredible charm that he has. He can be very effective, but there's a sadistic quality to him. A movie that actually captured this fairly well was a TV movie. It was a biopic of J. Edgar Hoover, starring Treat Williams. Mm-hmm. And very few people have seen it, although it's online now. And the guy was in MASH. David Ogden Stiers played FDR. And I fell out of my seat because it was a critical depiction of FDR. And it really played on the kind of sadistic sense of humor, the love of gossip. FDR could be very much the flatterer. It was, I thought, a very accurate depiction of all of those things coming together. And so there's a ruthlessness about him that I've seen for a long time. And as I did research for this book, and I kept the focus fairly narrow, not narrow so much really, in the sense that it was a lot of research, but I kept it narrow, focused on the Bill of Rights, right? What were his policies towards the First Amendment, towards privacy issues, towards, these basic protections. I tried to stay away from other issues and focus on that. And as it is, that took me well over 10 years to do research, and I could have gone on forever. But I felt I had to do a lot of primary research to get at some of these issues. So I looked at both the secondary and the primary document literature. The ACLU papers were very helpful. For example, they're voluminous, a lot of correspondence, a lot of debates, a lot of back and forth stuff. And I went to the FDR library and found quite a bit there as well in Hyde Park. And I've since contacted the people at the FDR library and tried to be cordial and friendly and sort of open the door. Hey, if you want a critical voice, I'm available. Mm-hmm. And we've been friendly, but I don't know if it's ever going to go to that extent. But certainly newspapers newspapers are archive.com, ProQuest. I'm used to the old way of doing things, microfilm, but that really has opened the door to get a kind of panoramic picture of things.
Oh, well, you had I mean, it's fascinating to look at it because the press back then was different. You had the Chicago Tribune and a lot of mainstream papers that were an alternative. There was like more stronger than Fox News would be an alternative to MSNBC or something like that. And that was it was just amazing how blatant that FDR and his administration was in going after these voices. I mean, obviously they were going after the more extreme voices like Father Coughlin, who had a huge audience. I mean, Father Coughlin, you could almost equate to Alex Jones maybe in terms of the audience he drew. And they certainly went after him, but they went after things like the Chicago Tribune and those conservative papers. But it was just so blatant. And you mentioned the ACLU, and the ACLU now informs us they're not so much concerned with civil liberties anymore, which is an odd thing for the American Civil Liberties Union to say. Mm-hmm. But back then, I was surprised that they were kind of inconsistent in this, where sometimes they seemed to step it up, but other times they rolled over because I mean some of these the committees you describe, Buchanan Committee, and some of these other ones were just blatantly clearly they were trying to suppress voices. I mean, how different was what they were doing than the original Alien and Sedition Act under John Adams?
I mean, what the government was doing, or the ACLU?
No, the government was doing. Yeah.
I think it was in some ways a little bit more subtle, but also maybe more pervasive. One of my chapters isn't on the Sedition Act; it's on surveillance, and through the Black Committee. And if anything, the surveillance of private telegrams. You're talking about millions of private telegrams, but there were sedition prosecutions during the war. The Socialist Workers' Party was prosecuted. There was the largest mass trial, I believe, in the history of Washington, D.C., was the sedition trial during the war, 1944. And it's very familiar with what's going on now. I think my yes. timing was unintentional, but almost yes. perfect, because sedition trials really had gone into abeyance for a long time, but have made a dramatic comeback in the last few years. In this sedition trial was some 30 plus defendants who were scooped up from all over the country, brought to Washington, D.C. It came about because FDR wanted a sedition trial. His attorney general really didn't want to do it. FDR wanted to go after major figures, but his attorney general kind of held him back. So they picked up all these small fry, people that ran like a little newsletter in Kansas and stuff like that, brought them all to Washington. They hadn't met each other for the most part. A lot of them didn't like each other. And they were put in this courtroom and charged with being part of a worldwide Nazi conspiracy to promote insubordination in the military. And this was a big show trial. Went on and got coverage from the press for a long time, was headline news. But then it just became a joke. And even a lot of people that were originally for it, including a lot of New Dealers, turned against it because they said, well, where's the evidence here? This is just a farce. And it was a poorly thought out by the government, and it just droned on. And then finally what happened, right, bring it to an end, is the judge, probably because he was so much, didn't expect this to happen, to be so difficult, he died, dropped dead of a heart attack. And they thought about appointing a new judge, but ultimately they decided, the government and the courts collectively decided, let's just drop this whole thing. And that's what they did.
Yeah, well, it's the players have changed somewhat because a lot of the even though today, of course, World War II is portrayed as a good war, and the opposition to it, most people think of it back then, well, they're calling people Nazis and everything. It must have been the right wing, but in fact, the America First Committee, which you don't go into too much, I talk about John T.
You want me to get that phone off, or just keep talking?
Oh, is there a phone?
Oh, you don't hear it? Okay,
no, I don't hear it. No, I don't.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, but
go ahead. I'm sorry.
So John T. Flynn was, in fact, like most of the America First Committee, John T. Flynn was a classical liberal, and I don't think you go into it there, but I found indications that Roosevelt was trying to personally cancel these people, kind of an early example of cancel culture. He went after Flynn with just a vengeance, where he called all the, because Flynn had written for all the big establishment newspapers at the time and magazines, and he blacklisted him basically afterwards. And most people don't realize that you mentioned Norman Thomas a lot in there. He was the socialist who was in the forefront of a lot of this stuff. And earlier, Eugene Debs had been that guy in World War I. So this was a lot of the left back then, and the anarchists, Sacco and Vanzetti, all that stuff that came earlier. But most of these were not right wingers, but they're kind of portrayed now. If you talk about opposition to World War II, especially, they would think, oh, well, it had to be like the American Bund, or something that you had to be allied with the Nazis. But the left was what was, and so Roosevelt was supposedly going against his own kind, but he just would not brook any dissent. I mean, do you get the sense that with his ego, and that this was a guy who probably couldn't take a joke about himself in private? Like he took criticism very well.
Yeah, I've got a good story there. Before I go on to the story, though, one of the leading anti-war, non-interventionist people was Senator Burton Wheeler.
Yes,
who sometimes portrayed as just fairly negative terms as this rube right winger or something.
Mm-hmm.
He was a New Deal insider.
Yes.
An ally of FDR, supported most of the New Deal programs, continued to have a New Deal voting record. Very good friend of Harry Truman, who actually defended him on occasion. But Wheeler was a leading critic of Roosevelt's foreign policy, and but really a key figure in the America First Committee, and that kind of thing. So that gives you an idea about how diverse that coalition was. But the story is, Roosevelt during World War I, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, much like his illustrious cousin Teddy had been. He followed the same career trajectory as Teddy. He was Assistant Secretary, and I guess he was in his 30s at that time. And some guy that was, I guess, sort of a quasi-anarchist, not a real, revolutionary, but I guess somewhat a critic, had done some articles in this newsletter he ran about FDR, and said, well, why isn't this guy in uniform? He's young enough. And Roosevelt got so mad that he wrote to the federal district attorney, I think it was in Atlanta, and said, can't we prosecute this guy for sedition? Can't we do something about him? And the guy wrote him back and said, this is during the Wilson era, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we really don't have enough evidence to go after this person. Sorry, Mr. Secretary. So that gives you a little idea of Roosevelt's sense of humor. Having said that, on the other side of that, if you listen to Roosevelt's speeches, and I did, I've listened to every single one of them, believe it or not, that are on audio. And he is very different than Trump in for the most part. Maybe that's one example. He would do that kind of thing privately. But he's very different from someone like Trump in that he rarely made it personal, right? He'd get up there and he would make jokes, and he would kind of belittle his opponents. He would exaggerate bad things about them, but he never really got personal. He had this voice that was a warm voice that was bewitching in a way that would kind of draw you in. He had a sense of humor. So he's much better at disarming criticism than someone like Trump, who would immediately get up there and say, call them names and personalize it. FDR would do that in private. He was very personal in private, but in public, in his public face, he could somehow separate that persona very effectively.
No, he was a master politician, obviously. And but
on that, someone said that he would have been a top radio announcer if he'd never been a politician.
No, he had that very
do it. Yeah,
he had that very patrician way of speaking. Very like Thurston B. Howell. I say capital. It reminds me of that from Gilligan's Island. But early must protest. That's kind of, he had that really upper crust voice. But one of the things you mentioned in there, and I want to ask you something about this. I'm sure you must know this, but you talk about the internment of the Japanese Americans during World War II, that most people know about, and they later their descendants were given some kind of reparations. But I talk in my books about how there were also German Americans and Italian Americans, a much smaller number, but they were also put in camps. And what we found, and Peter Seakosh is in the chat room, he's a great researcher for me in this area, but we found that they stole, I don't think you touched on that they stole the property, the homes and businesses of these people, and it amounted to billions of dollars. And I'm talking about all of them, Japanese, Germans, and Italians, never gave them that. I think it's just an incredible crime especially when, we centered around what German camps were doing, but to be putting people in camps and then to steal their property. I don't know if you knew how much you know about that or not.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was just outrageous, and you'd see it even at the small level, right? If they had pets, the pets had to be destroyed, had to be taken to the camp, right? We can look at it in that kind of trivial way. Well, it's not so trivial, but that gives you an idea of the ruthlessness. They orphans. If the orphan was of Japanese ancestry, they had to go to camp. And I think there were great injustices, and you may know more about the German and the Japanese camps. You may, because I didn't focus on the research, but I think I would put the Japanese camps in a special category because you're simply put there for ancestry. If your ancestry is, although they didn't intern everybody, right? Hawaii, the East Coast, for example. It was on the West Coast, but if you're of Japanese ancestry, you've got to go to a camp. And of course, these are people that had a fair amount of wealth. They were the first model minority, I guess you could say. The Japanese were very successful farmers, especially, and produced a very high percentage of the strawberries, I think, in California. It was like most of them were produced by Japanese farmers, and they lost, they had to sell at bargain basement prices, if that. Lost a lot of property.
Yeah, but keep in mind, I mean, these people had no recourse. I don't know after, and I don't know that. Like once they were released, and I assume were they kept in camps until the end of the war, or were they released before the end of the war?
They were kept in camps. Well, the camps finally emptied out in 1946. However, the government announced, the government had a heads up that the Korematsu decision was coming in. This was, I think, December 44, which essentially said, essentially said that the internment was legal, right? They knew it was coming. And so right before that, they said, well, we don't think we need these camps anymore. So they started to wind down in late 1944. Now, FDR was under a lot of pressure from people in his administration, the Secretary of the Interior, just about everyone in the administration said, we don't need to keep these people in camps anymore. There's no military threat anymore. And he said, look, we have an election coming up. So FDR basically did, just let them stay there, let them languish behind barbed wire throughout the 1944 campaign. And then not long after that was over with, began the process of releasing them. They were kept there till, almost the end of the war. Well, and I use the term concentration camps, and some people have differed with me on that, but that's what FDR called them. So why not go by what he calls them? Now, I'm not saying they were similar to the death camps of Hitler. I'm not putting them in that category, but they were called concentration camps. He called them that he called them that in 1944 in a press conference, for example. So I think that's an accurate label because I think they're in a bit of a different category,
right,
than other kinds of internment camps.
So just looking at
Japanese, like for the Italians and the Germans, I'm not minimizing the damage that was done there. I'm just saying they're in a different category.
Well, and there were way. How many were there? The Japanese were how many?
Oh, it was 100 and something thousand.
Yeah, so it was over 100,000. Yeah. And I think the Germans and the Italians amounted to, maybe a couple thousand. I'm not sure, but it was a much smaller amount.
But some of this is, can you do it, right?
Yeah.
They talked about a little bit about Hawaii. FDR wanted to intern the Japanese in Hawaii. That's 1/3 of the population. He wanted to move them to one of the smaller islands. I forget which one it was. He wanted to move them to one of the smaller islands. but basically the military there stopped them. There were people pushing back, and basically red tape and so forth said, hey, geez, we'd have to divert American ships from the Pacific War, right? To move these people. And they didn't do it. But FDR wanted to do it. But they're a third of the population. They're essential to the economy. So they didn't. They just did it on the West Coast, partly because they could.
Yeah, picked and choose. But it's just, this guy gets away with, and going, I go back for, I don't know how much you know about this, but one thing I found out thanks to Peter Seacox was that when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, this guy was just a horrible person forever. One of the things he was, when Woodrow Wilson, and I'll have a lot about that in the American Memory Hole, my book could be published next year, but Wilson, in kind of a forerunning to our interventionist foreign policy later on, he invaded a bunch of countries. He invaded Mexico like 8 different times, but he he invaded Haiti, and FDR, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, along with his cousin and some other guy, I forget the guy's name, they were planning, they wanted to get this in Haiti. Now this is after you go, an all black country. They wanted to buy and set up their own plantation in Haiti.
I've never heard that, but I find it easy to believe.
Yeah, and behind the scenes, FDR was, you talk about racist, but I mean, this guy, and supposedly the guy he was buying it with, he made a comment about how one of the ministers, one of the high-ranking people in Haiti, but how he looks like one of the ones we bred back in the day. Talked about his high thighs and everything. We would have had it, basically. And FDR liked the joke so much that he would later tell it at dinners when he was president. So this guy got and then he has camps, and then he's got cancel culture. He's trying to shut down, criticize press. So that it's amazing that Roosevelt has a reputation. Basically, his entire reputation rests on the fact he won World War II, I guess. I mean, what else good can we say about him? The Great Depression was not, over because of anything he did. It was the World War II got us out of the Depression, right? What can we say?
Well, people perceive that he got us out of the Depression.
Though. Yeah.
So that perception is still, very strong. And then again, people remember the speeches, right? The fireside chats, the reassuring speeches. Herbert Hoover was just not very good at that kind of thing. So you got to contrast, be someone like, kind of a fumbler and a stumbler like Hoover, and somebody that's smooth and very upbeat like Roosevelt. But there's a perception that he got us out of the Depression. I think a lot of that has to do with World War II, that even that recovery was kind of a phony one, but you did get a recovery, right?
Yeah.
And so people tended to forget about the persistence of the Great Depression, where you still had double-digit unemployment on the eve of World War II.
Well, Peter comes right up with the names. John McElhenney, that was the guy's name that he was going into business with. And
I need to look that up.
In Haiti, yeah. Oh, it's incredible. We because I was looking at your book and I saw there's so many things we missed and so many things you have in there, but a lot of the stuff we have you didn't have. So and of course my book is about a lot more than just FDR. It's kind of a timeline, but I do focus on him quite a bit. And this one of the names I saw, and you mentioned Peter had asked how you heard about me, and we talked before on that you had heard me on Ocelli. Chuck Ocelli used to produce a show for me, JFK guy. So you're obviously familiar with the JFK assassination. That's my wheelhouse issue. But naturally, I perked up at the several mentions of John Apt, who was mentioned in your book, because we all know that was the lawyer Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly requested.
You keyed in on that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that stood out. That jumped right out at me. So tell me about John Apt and what his role was in this.
Well, John Apt, of course, as all your listeners know, or they should know if they listen to you, was Oswald wanted John Apt to represent him. And Apt was known for representing Communist Party members accused of sedition and that kind of thing. Was a New York lawyer, but was basically a communist sympathizer, and people knew it by that time. Well, they didn't really know that necessarily in the 40s, because I think he was still sort of he was in the federal government. He was sort of a secret communist. but he got this position in the fairly high up position in the Department of Justice, some sort of, I don't know if he was assistant attorney general. There were a lot of those, but he had some sort of fairly important title. Well, there was a guy named Rumley. I'm trying to remember his first name. Yeah. Anyway, I should know this. I wrote about him.
Yeah.
Rumley was a guy with the National Committee for Constitutional Government, National Committee to Uphold Constitutional Government, which had fought the Supreme Court packing successfully, and then fought a plan that FDR had organized for government reorganization. And he got a lot of money. Rumley got a lot of money from the Gannett papers. Gannett was an anti-New Dealer. And so he had been very successful, and he was a fighter. And Rumley was called in before this committee called the Minton Committee, which was led by a leading New Dealer named Sherman Minton. They were supposed to investigate lobbies, but basically what they were doing is very inquisitorial investigations of anti-New Dealers. So they called Rumley in, and they asked him all sorts of information about, Minton asked him about membership lists, who are your members, who contributes to your organization. And Minton just said, that's private information. I'm not giving you that information. And so Minton was like, you can't do that. You're supposed to, they're supposed to go along with this. And they were basically talking about, well, should we try to prosecute this guy for contempt? Because Rumley was actually getting a lot of public support. People like Wheeler were saying this is inquisitorial, this guy's being persecuted, and a lot of people are sympathetic to him. So what the Minton Committee did is it went to the Department of Justice, and they said, we'd like to prosecute this guy for contempt of Congress. Rumley, right? Rumley's this big anti-New Deal guy. We'd like to prosecute him for contempt. And so they sent it over to Apt, who was sort of he was fairly high up in the department. He's the guy who would do the research and should we bring the case or not? And he looked at this case, this contempt case, and Apt said, no, juries would be sympathetic to him. We'd lose this case. This doesn't, we don't need to do this. We shouldn't do this. It'd backfire on the Department of Justice. So they ended up dropping it. So interestingly enough, Apt, who's a communist sympathizer at the time, has the good sense to say, don't touch this. Don't prosecute this guy, even though he's this right with this kind of conservative organization that fought court packing and all this. Meanwhile, if you look at what the Daily Worker is saying, the Communist Party paper, they're portraying Rumley as the worst fascist ever, saying he should go to jail, behind bars, and all that. So I thought that was an interesting contrast there between, which shows people are unpredictable. But Apt, though he was a communist sympathizer, definitely, Communist Party member probably, says, no, we shouldn't prosecute this guy. You'll just make him a martyr. And he was, of course, right about that. But here you have the party itself that he belongs to, its public face. They are totally for prosecuting Rumley for anything.
It's just interesting to my audience as well.
He might have been a good lawyer for Oswald. I don't think he ever really took it too seriously.
Well, that's one of the things. Certainly, as an assassination researcher, that I found incomprehensible is that he just kind of here he has the most notorious alleged criminal, maybe in modern history, certainly of the day. And he wants him as his lawyer. Talk about, don't lawyers like to take big cases and make their profiles grow? He had I think he said something like, I'm sorry, my caseload is full or something like that. It's like he just blew him off. It's like, wow, that's...
I think that's probably because of his Communist Party loyalties. And he sees this as bad for the party.
Well,
that's my impression, right? That's a big factor for him. He's a good party loyalist.
Peter Seakosh has can you read that on the screen? The question he has for you there? Can you read that or not? David heard the schemes.
Yeah, I can read it, and I don't know anything about it, but except the last line I agree with.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, because it's So the
he was
basic,
something of a new wheeler dealer. FDR, was had a lot of Wall Street connections. In fact, there's some good evidence that he really wanted, he wanted, he wanted. There were opportunities out there that he really wanted that they didn't pan out, and that's part of the reason he ended up seeking a political career, or at least running for governor of New York.
yeah, he definitely wasn't what he was supposed to. And you and I, I'm sure, probably disagree on Huey Long. I think I'm Huey Long's main number one fan now. So I'm trying to restore his reputation, and I've been in contact with his great granddaughter, who's the only one out there trying to continue his legacy, and discovered a lot of information about him. And as you know, I'm sure FDR considered him the most dangerous person in America. He called him.
Well, that's how radio regulation. Much of modern radio regulation stems from the attempt to force Father Coughlin off the air. Basically the modern kind of, I guess you could say that kind of an equal time. They use kind of an equal time rule against him, combined with a rule that was sort of enforced by the FCC, but the network sort of put it forward, but they were pressured to, which is you couldn't buy airtime. Basically, that was Coughlin bought his own airtime, and they basically said, "We think that's unethical. You shouldn't be able to do that." And also, radio stations were under pressure. Well, if you do let him on the air, then you have to provide somebody. You have to provide equal time. It was just too much trouble. So gradually, Coughlin, partly because of things he was saying as well, beginning in 1938, 39. Ended up being sort of marginalized increasingly, and ended up sort of dropping his radio program.
He was I was talking about Huey Long. Maybe you got the mix up with it, but Huey's that's my guy, and he was. I don't know if you knew this, and that's an interesting anecdote. But when Huey Long had the audacity to write, he wrote his an autobiography, "My First Days in the White House," right before he announced that he was going to run for president, and in it he announced his cabinet. And interestingly enough, his Secretary of War was Smedley Butler, who wrote War is a Racket, and it's the foremost. So how much war there would have been in a Huey Long administration with Smedley Butler as Secretary of War. And just to irritate Roosevelt further, he busted him down back to Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a big Huey Long defender. However, attempts to make Long a kind of precursor to fascism isn't too convincing, because there's no real evidence that he was sympathetic to Hitler or Mussolini.
No, not at all. And Huey Long, he's the only. And this is why I keep coming back to him, and I've got great response from people who didn't know about him. But not only you gotta, I think investigate somebody who you can look at the congressional record. It's still out there. A month before he was assassinated, he predicted on the floor of the Senate that he would be assassinated, and he basically accused the Roosevelt administration of plotting to kill him. And I don't think any other senator has ever done that. And then he's killed. And but there's so much there, and he was one of the foremost critics of Roosevelt early on. He supported him, and he's the one that started noticing. I've got all his great speeches and everything. But they're all there. Baruch and all the bankers. He basically criticized him, said he's surrounded by Wall Street, and he basically was criticized. And he talked about Roosevelt. God only knows what Roosevelt was saying about Huey behind his back, but he made, I forget the name of Roosevelt's yacht, but whatever it was, he called Roosevelt Lord of the whatever his yacht was, and claimed that's where he spent World War I and all this stuff, and he's worth every penny we paid him because he spent. I mean, you have to read some of the stuff he says, but I think he's been treated unfairly. That's just another.
Well, they were very fearful about how well he would have performed in a three-way matchup.
Absolutely.
In 1936.
Yeah.
And, that's sort of, I guess, why I confused Coughlin there, because, he's assassinated in 35, and then there is a third-party effort in 1936 that Coughlin's really behind, trying to bring together a lot of the old Long people, but it doesn't go anywhere. But Long himself was feared. He was seen as someone who could get a lot of votes. because
Well,
he
and
was much more popular in the North than a lot of people
yeah,
expected.
he was. You talked about Roosevelt. Roosevelt would have been. They really didn't have debates back then, but Roosevelt would have been, able to, overshadow anyone with his. Or he was a great orator, obviously, but Huey Long was the only one that could have matched him and was better. Huey Long was incredible because of his wit, and if they had had a debate, it would have been interesting because he was something that Roosevelt wasn't used to seeing. There's my White Wolf, who's one of the world's foremost experts on Catholicism. He says Father Coughlin was so dangerous, Roosevelt had to pressure Pius XI to pull him off the air because Bishop Gallagher stood by Father Coughlin and told Roosevelt and the U.S. Bishops' Conference to go pound sand. Do you know anything about that?
Well, yeah, and by that time, Coughlin was off the radio. However, because of these things I talked about, he still had a magazine called Social Justice.
Yes, yes.
And that was still publishing. And, when the Pearl Harbor attack came, it said we support fighting the war, but it was still critical of a lot of details of the administration. And there was a real effort to ban social justice, or basically deprive it, take away its postal rights. And that probably, there's a good chance that would have happened, but it would have been awfully messy because Coughlin would have fought that quite effectively because they had something like 200,000 subscribers, right? It would have been a messy situation, but they were gunning for that. But basically, Roosevelt used contacts with the Catholic Church, and Coughlin was essentially instructed to drop out of politics, and he did. And so there wasn't a prosecution of Coughlin, but there probably would have been had it not been for that. A lot of people focus on Coughlin, but really the leading critic of Roosevelt on the radio is more forgotten now. But he was very big. He was network. Coughlin was not network, at least by the late 30s. This guy was, I think it was NBC. His name was Bo Carter. And Carter was he rivaled someone like Lowell Thomas, for example, in popularity. And he was on I think 3 days a week. And he was originally a supporter of Roosevelt, but he turned against him. And he was basically forced off the air in 1938. But he doesn't get as much attention. But I think he was regarded as a bigger threat than Coughlin by that.
Well, I think Coughlin's easier to criticize because of his, he was obsessed with Jews. So that's it's easier to go there.
Really, I would say by 38, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on anti-Semitism early on, but then he's really by 37, 38, he's starting to move in that direction quite heavily. Originally he was allied with Roosevelt, right? In the early part of the New Deal period.
Well, Coughlin was a strange character because he was a far leftist who really was anti-Semitic. So you don't get that too often, but he was, because he was not right wing at all. Unless you want to say he's a pure Catholic, I guess. But in terms of social justice, that's why he named that. It was a very strange thing. But I just listening to and reading your book, I'm struck by the parallels between what was happening then. Obviously, there was no internet or anything, and really radio was fledgling. But the fact they were trying to shut down radio and change the mailing status to make it harder for these people to get their pamphlets and newsletters and everything out. I think that's almost directly what we've seen in recent years with the social media set, with what YouTube has done, and Twitter and Facebook, where they're canceling people, canceling their accounts, monitoring what you can say. Isn't that almost exactly the same thing, just a modern version of it?
Yeah, an interesting example is sort of Bo Carter of, I guess you'd say, what you would see in the Twitter files, right? I think there's quite a parallel there. Bo Carter, again, was very popular radio commentator, was going after the administration on court packing and other issues, was really, having some effectiveness. And Roosevelt basically went to people in the administration and said, we got to find a way to get this guy off the air. They investigated his citizenship. He was originally from Canada, but they couldn't find anything there. They really went after him in a big way. And then finally, they got the idea of going to a guy named Joseph Davies. You ever heard of Davies?
No.
He wrote a book called, there was a movie made about him called Mission to Moscow.
Oh, I remember that
Davies
movie,
was the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. You should see that movie, by the way.
Well, Mission,
is it,
movie. Yeah, isn't that, yeah, it's a pro-Stalin movie.
Yeah, anyway, yes. He was a big Democratic Party operative. And he was married to Marjorie Merriweather Post of the Post fortune, right? That they owned what's that? Is it Mar-a-Lago? I forget, but they own the Trump estate at one time.
Oh,
whatever. And so she was big in the Democratic Party. Wayne Davies is married to her. So they say, could the Post sponsor Bo Carter? Can they put some pressure on the network? And that's what they did. It was all, there's the correspondence is there. Davies, using his wife, put pressure on the network to, first of all, to force Carter to stop talking about controversial issues. And then ultimately he ended up being forced off the air. So this was an example of doing it behind the scenes. This was really one of the few anti-New Deal radio commentators left on network radio, and he was forced off. And by 38, there are no anti-deal commentators anymore on the radio.
Isn't that something?
Because of various kinds of pressure, including that.
Yeah, it's very scary, and you see elements of it happening today. And it's just, I just, as a civil libertarian, that's why I'm interested in your book. And there's not many of us left. I can tell you, we're a dying breed. There are not too many civil libertarians. How many people you think in America today support the right of people that to say something they really disagree with? Almost no one. Well,
I call it a free rider issue, because if you do if you value the First Amendment, you should defend the rights of people you absolutely despise.
For us, yes.
Because if you do that, and other people on the other side do that for you, you make the protections of the First Amendment much stronger. Sure. But everybody is off in their little camps and only defend their side. So that means they're more vulnerable in the end.
Yeah, and it's not free speech. Free speech is you can't have an asterisk on it. I don't know if you know this. I learned this when I was writing my book, Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, 1776, 1963. But people always say, well, you have free speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, I did not know where that came from, and I just was accidentally researching during the Wilson administration, which was pretty bad too. I mean, FDR was worse, but Wilson was pretty bad too, and he jailed a bunch of World War I protesters, and they had a lot more then. As you point out, by World War II, people had gotten the message. There weren't as many, but Eugene Debs was one of those, and they appealed to the Supreme Court. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, great liberal, in his ruling, he supported Wilson's right to imprison World War I protesters, and he used the expression, "You can't yell fire in a crowded theater." That was where it came from, and as I point out many times, however you look at it, people protesting a war are not yelling fire in a crowded theater. That's where the expression comes from. Almost no American knows that. So when you people tell you that, anybody listen to me, throw that right back in their face. Do you know where that comes from?
It's like a lot of these expressions. The Constitution is not a suicide pact. Sometimes right-wingers like it. Sometimes left-wingers like that statement. Mm-hmm. But the crowded theater thing, I would see that a lot during this period. And one interesting example was there was a mayor, he was a city boss of Memphis named Crump, and he ran a political machine. And right before the 1940 election, Crump basically shut down a Black Republican Party. The Republican Party in Memphis was led by an African American, and they were going all out because Blacks could vote in Memphis, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. And Crump went all out to shut them down. And it's just egregious stuff. But anyway, later, the famous African American came in to sort of show solidarity, A. Philip Randolph, who was a great defender of free speech. And he went to Memphis, and he would criticize this Crump organization. And Crump's supporters said, well, he's shouting fire in a crowded theater by calling for integration. Because Randolph has said, I will debate the mayor, but only if the audience is integrated. And they said, well, that's crying, So
Yeah.
That's one story I tell in my book about how Roosevelt was just really bad on race in general, not just when it comes to African American or to Japanese Americans.
Yeah, Jesse Owens told the story. We hear the story all the time where it's made to look, make Hitler look even worse. That Hitler refused to shake his hand at the 1936 Olympics or something like that. But Jesse Owens later in life, and I have the quotes in Crimes and Cover-Ups, he hated Roosevelt. And he said that he was treated better in Germany than he was in America. And when he came back, FDR only invited the white Olympians to the White House. He didn't invite the hero of the Olympics, Jesse Owens. And he's, you don't hear that story too much. So all you got to do is scratch the surface a little bit and see what a bad record Roosevelt really had. There's a question on there again from Peter. What are your thoughts on the Blue Eagle program?
Well, again, I didn't focus so much on that.
I know it's not.
Although I think you could tell probably some interesting free speech stories related to that. Yep. But the NRA was, one of the closest approximations of economic fascism that we've ever had. And there were minimum price controls. This is at a time when people could not afford to buy food. They have price controls. They would have one guy was prosecuted for pressing a suit for, I guess it was for 20 cents when the NRA price was like 30 cents. The guy went to, people would actually go to jail for violating these rules. It was tremendously discriminatory against African Americans because you would have these minimum wage provisions during a time when wages were falling. And so racists kind of had an incentive just to hire white people because they had all these people applying for jobs and they had minimum floor in the wages. So they ended up just saying, well, I guess we'll cater to our racist sentiments. So the NRA is, I think the Blue Eagle is certainly part of the NRA. I think the mayor in Hollywood hated the NRA. What's his first name? The Hollywood producer.
Oh God, I don't
Mayor.
know. I don't know. Maybe somebody in the chat knows. Peter might know. Chris Graves, somebody out there. I don't know.
Yeah, but JB Mayer, whatever his name is. But
anyway,
he called it the Blue Buzzard.
I thought you meant like the mayor of Hollywood. Louis B. Mayer. You're talking about the MGM.
And if any of you want to have you might want to play this sometime. But the Jimmy Durante did a skit promoting the NRA, which is just unbelievable. And it ends with this curtain being pulled down and a picture of Roosevelt. It's really, whoa, man.
Oh, the propaganda was so
just
bad.
Google Durante National Recovery Administration.
Yeah. I thought you were talking about the mayor. I'm thinking Mayor. No, Louis B. Mayer, of course.
Louis B. Mayer. That's what
I'm MGM.
Brain freeze today. Yeah.
But but it's so if you look at this, it's a wonder, how does this guy have any kind of a good reputation? So when you decided to do this, so and again, if you want to just kind of go into so I want to give you a chance to, to tell basically what's in your book, because I'm kind of going off the track here. Some of the stuff isn't in your book, but so you basically talked about it. Another thing, and you went into this, and you might want to talk this. Well, when we think today, we think a lot of these things when we attribute it to Nixon going after his enemies, the enemies list, and using the IRS. FDR was a master with the IRS. He used the IRS to go after his political with a far greater frequency than Nixon ever did. And by the way, the blacks, in terms of Social Security, I don't know if you knew this or not, but when Social Security was passed, they exempted like the kind of work that most blacks did at that time.
Yeah,
like maids and
1940s.
Yeah, so they those people didn't get Social Security, and so that just awful things he did. That he's certainly no civil rights hero. But so basically, the first the first attempts at because there were a series of committees, as you talk about, to try to, and sometimes the ACLU was supportive and sometimes they weren't. They were very inconsistent. But the idea was basically to quash criticism of the administration. It was basically alien and sedition thing. But they started before the war. Once the war started, then they could use the excuse Lincoln did, and people have ever since then. You can't, are you with us or are you with the enemy? But when did the first foray into this? When did the Roosevelt administration first try to squelch, to close down opposition newspapers and things like that, and radio programs?
Yeah, just real briefly, a good portion, I don't know if it's most of it, but a lot of my book is about the New Deal period. And I also look at the links between the New Deal and the war. So the argument that you sometimes, not say you're making that some people would make that, oh, this is a war, where it's wars. Roosevelt has this bias, this predilection against protection of civil liberties, basically because Roosevelt is an ends-oriented guy. Going all the way back, that's consistent. If the end is proper, just and proper, don't worry about the means. That is his mentality. Well, how did it really start? Well, he's elected in 1932 and he's tremendously popular. Everybody is willing to give him really whatever he wants. And so the New Deal just comes through very easily. But then by 34, 35, there is discontent. There is rising opposition. And so Roosevelt basically says, look, we got to do something about this. So he goes to a senator named Hugo Black from my state, Alabama.
Yes.
And Black, he says, we need your help. We want to set up a committee to investigate lobbying. We want you to head it and go for it, man. Go after these people that are, at that point, by 34, 35, the Supreme Court is overturning some of the New Deal programs. Congress is getting more and more critical. Roosevelt's fallen in the polls. We often forget that. And even in early 36, there are polls showing him losing the election, credible polls. So he's worried about this. He wants to strike Black back, but like a lot of this way is indirect. So his Black do it. And Black is very much an attack dog, very ruthless. And he starts investigating these anti-New Deal organizations and calling these people in. And he calls them in and they fight back and they sometimes get sympathetic headlines. So Black gets an idea. I don't know if he got the idea, but someone got the idea. What if I could get these people, these witnesses, their private communications? And what's the most private communication of all, really? The one where you're more likely to be candid and that kind of thing. More likely to let your guard down. Telegrams. More than 50% of long-distance communication in the 1930s is private telegrams. They are the email of their time. They're instantaneous. In many cases, businesses maintain, they'll have, telegraph operators right there. And people will, again, say things they wouldn't say in public. They don't save their telegrams, right? Generally, they don't put a lot of thought into them. And so he gets this idea and he finds out that there's a law. It goes back a long time that the telegraph companies, Western Union's the big one at the time, but there are others, have to keep copies of all telegrams. And there'd been subpoenas before for those things, and one involving Debs, but they were somewhat limited. Black really wants a wholesale kind of thing. He doesn't bother with a subpoena. He goes to the Federal Communications Commission, again, working with the administration, and they basically issue an order to Western Union and then to the other companies, give this guy access to copies of all telegrams. And so Black, for example, says, I want all telegrams sent over a 9-month period to and from members of Congress. He did that, right? Then he starts to target specific individuals. I want all their telegrams. And he goes to Western Union. He brings his staffers with him. He teams up with FCC staffers, and they start pulling out files. Oh, Congressman Burton Wheeler, Senator Wheeler, here are all his telegrams. And he goes through them. And he copies what he likes. He, He gets his incriminating information. He tells them just to keep black, says, well, this is about lobbying. So if they're discussing things that don't have anything to do with lobbying, just look past that. Private information. Don't bother with that. Now, of course, anything would be lobbying. What we're doing is lobbying, right? By the committee's definition, any sort of attempt to influence public opinion would be lobbying, basically, right? So they go through these. And how many do they go through? They go through thousands a day for months. And I did the math. And believe it or not, it adds up. This was said at the time, but I said, this can't be true. But the math works. Over 3 million private telegrams. Over 3 million were examined by the Black Committee with no subpoena in a traditional sense. It was no subpoena. Basically, it was an FCC order. And that's what they do. And then he would call people in. He says, well, on June 8th, you said this. And people would go, what? They were blindsided. Gradually, Western Union didn't like this. They didn't want to cooperate. They started to inform people that their telegrams are being searched. And one of these people that they informed was a guy named Silas Strawn, headed a very big Chicago law firm that's been in the news lately. Strawn was the head of the Republican Finance Committee. He was head of the National Golf Association. He was head of the Chamber of Commerce. He was like Mr. Powerful. He was really pissed off, and he brought suit, saying you're violating the Fourth, the Fifth Amendment. You're violating, my rights under this privacy rights under the Constitution. And Strawn brought suit, and other people brought suit, and he won. He actually won. It was in the lower courts. It didn't go up because what happened was the Black Committee said, well, we've already completed our field work. All right. As Alice Roosevelt Longsworth said, they had their booty. They had everything they needed, right? They had all the information. And we don't plan any in future investigations. And the court basically said, well, we wish you could sanction you, but we don't see how we can, but you're prohibited from doing this again. And it was an important precedent. But there was a big reaction against this. Newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, big difference with today, we're condemning the Black Inquisition. We're comparing it to the Russian secret police. Mm-hmm. The ACLU eventually, got into the act. There were members of Congress, New Dealers like Emanuel Seller. Was a big. When I grew up, I remember Seller. He was a big sort of typical Democratic hack.
Yes.
On the crusade against this, he thought this was like Mussolini. So there was a big public reaction against this. It was headline news. And it's sort of been forgotten by historians to a great extent, but it was all over the front pages.
No, it has, and you should have historians and journalists doing articles and case studies of how. But again, we see the censorship today is largely supported by the last people that should support it, the press. I mean, they're gung ho for it. Please censor us, please do anything you can. But they should see how this. There's so many parallels here. It was a different form of media, radio shows being so popular, and mailing things out by snail mail. But it's the same process. The government.
Well, at the time, there was an interesting difference. Maybe it's a difference. I don't know. The print press was anti-Roosevelt. And something like 60% of the print press endorsed the Republican in 1936, for example. Yeah. They were overwhelmingly anti-Roosevelt, but radio was in Roosevelt's hip pocket. He completely controlled radio. They weren't going to do anything to alienate him because there was always a threat that he might nationalize it, implied, but it was there. So that was where most people were starting to get their news by this time. The newspapers were already on the way out in many ways. So we had radio thoroughly locked down. And if it hadn't been for the print press, it would have been much more difficult. But at least you had the print press was willing to criticize the administration.
Yeah, boy, things have flipped there. I remember even when Kennedy was in office, he talked about the Republican press. Back then, the newspapers were still largely, boy, that changed. But Peter's got another question for you. Are you familiar with the large number of protesters? World War protesters that went to jail, 16,000 draft resistors were still lingering in prison by 1947.
I wasn't aware it was that high. years ago when I did my BA thesis, I wrote about a pacifist group in Minneapolis, because I went to University of Minnesota, and they were supporting conscientious objection and that kind of thing. And of course, they were doing it within the system, but there were some people that just refused to cooperate. And the ones that were the best known to me were the Jehovah's Witnesses, because there was a question that would always be asked by draft boards, and it was called the Armageddon question. And they would ask Jehovah's Witnesses the Armageddon question and said, would you fight in the war of Armageddon? Because the Jehovah's Witnesses were against fighting in any war except the war of Armageddon. So if they answered, yes, I'd fight in the war of Armageddon, they would be rejected for conscientious objector status. And a lot of them went to jail. There was a very famous case of like some guy had 7 sons or something. All of them went to jail. So that's the one that's the most familiar to me. They were very much in your face sort of draft resistors. And they could not get this conscientious objector status, right? If you were willing to do that and sort of try to be fairly harmless, you could get some deal because that process had been set up. But if you were just taking on the system, you go to jail.
Absolutely. And so how do you think Roosevelt would, I personally think he'd fit right in today because his personality would be perfect as a Democratic. I don't know that he'd necessarily gravitate to transgenderism or anything like that, but I think he would fit into much of the authoritarian bent of today's Democrats, where I think obviously that was there with him back in the 1930s. He wanted to quelch dissent. Somebody said he didn't know. We got to shut you down. You're a traitor. You're an insurrectionist. I think personally he'd probably fit right in today. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I think and instead they're stuck with Joe Biden. It just shows how weak the field is. I mean, Roosevelt was a master, a master at deflating criticism, a master manipulator, somebody that was very good about getting ahead of things. He was an ideologue in one sense. Roosevelt's default position was very much on the political left, but he was also pragmatic enough that if something wasn't going to fly, he would pull off from it. For example, there was a bill proposed by Senator Minton that I think Roosevelt suggested to Minton. And the bill was, sound familiar? Maybe this sounds familiar. Mm-hmm. Minton proposed a bill to make it a felony to publish any article known to be false. It was say it again.
Misinformation, disinformation. And
I think Roosevelt was the guy that suggested Minton do it. I don't have proof, but I think that's what it was happening. Because Minton was not the kind of guy to do this on his own. To see how this go over, right? Because Roosevelt was very much against fake news. He sounded a lot like Trump. It's false news. You guys, he would talk to a reporter. He said, I really like you reporters. I have affection for you, but I know you're often told what to write. And I have sympathy for you that you can't choose what you want to write, because they're after me or whatever. I don't know how I got on this tangent. We were talking about Roosevelt. Remind me where this all started.
Well, no, but I mean, I think there's so many, we can certainly look to.
But I mean my point there with Minton was this is the kind of thing Trump would barrel in and do very publicly. Roosevelt would send a trial balloon up, and if it didn't fly, the Minton bill was so unpopular, nobody backed it. They dropped that very quickly. So Roosevelt would do that kind of thing. He wouldn't stick his neck out usually, unless he had all of his ducks in a row. And he would do a lot of things sort of privately through private manipulation.
What do you think of I've had a guy on my show, Steve Ubaney, who wrote the book, Who Murdered FDR? He's got some convincing evidence that Roosevelt was slowly poisoned by somebody. What do you know about that or think about that?
I know absolutely nothing about that. I mean, I guess, I've no knowledge of that theory. The book that I've used to really get a sense, or that has given me shed the most light for me, at least, of Roosevelt's health disastrous health situation was a book by called The New Dealer's War.
Mm-hmm.
I think this was similar to my title, by
Mm-hmm.
Fleming.
Mm-hmm.
And in this book, it's really quite a good book. He says FDR was just a health disaster by 1944.
Yeah.
There was a lot of cover up about how bad his health was, how disastrous it was. And they basically, people knew he was going to die, which makes his culpability even greater for, he brings in Harry Truman and doesn't tell him a thing, right?
Yeah.
He doesn't tell him a thing.
Well, he looks shockingly, but if you look at pictures of him like from 43 to 44, whatever, the last year or so, he just, it's unbelievable how terrible he looked, ashen and lost weight and everything. And he wasn't that old. I think maybe 60s, early 60s or something. And, but the most amazing thing about it is after he died suddenly like that, there was no autopsy done, which a lot of people find suspicious.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, it is true certainly that his health was deteriorating. If you listen to his last speech was after he returned from Yalta. Good drones on and on and on. It is just, and you compare that with his speeches even a few years before.
Yeah.
I mean, he gave the follow speech in 1944. That was a good speech. But by 45, this speech is just, this guy's out to lunch. It's just rambling on and on and on. He's slurring and he doesn't sound good at all.
What kind of feedback have you gotten from the book? Have you heard from Roosevelt fans who are upset that you said something negative about him, or what is your college said about it? I mean, your fellow professors and everything.
Very little in terms of pushback, surprisingly. I'm trying to get the book out there. I mean, I've done a lot of research. I want people to read it who are Roosevelt fans, because I think that the research holds up. I'm a trained historian, and I'm in that world, and I try to use, I try to be very rigorous in the way I did this. So it's not, I didn't write this with like, I hate Roosevelt and I'm going to find the facts to get him. I immersed myself in the primary material. So I haven't gotten a lot of pushback. Now, one interesting thing, maybe this will end up scuttling that, is I've done a lot of research at the Roosevelt Library, Presidential Library in Hyde Park. And they did a survey recently, they did an exhibit on race, which was called an unflinching exhibit on race. And I know some stuff that wasn't in the exhibit. So I contacted them and said, well, why didn't you put this stuff in? So I tried to maintain a cordial correspondence with them. And I basically sort of left the door open. Hey, if you guys want me to come out there, be on a panel or something. So I'm hopeful that, and I did get one historian did a blurb for me. Her name is Ellen Schrecker. Schrecker is very much on the political left. She's a leading historian of McCarthyism. And just, I had some correspondence with her that was friendly, and I thought, well, why don't I ask her? Will she do a blurb for the book? So I said, would you be willing to do a blurb? I'll send you a copy of the book. And she said, okay. And she did one. It was a nice little blurb. And so there are people on the left that have read it and that think that it holds up well. And but I haven't gotten that kind of reaction yet. I'm hoping to get it, but the book's only been out a couple weeks.
Yeah, no, it's obviously well, meticulously researched, and you can't argue with it. And certainly it's up my alley in terms of I write and talk about this all the time, where there's this impulse to censor on the part of almost anybody. I mean, pretty much the only president left that I like is John F. Kennedy. That's my boy. I admit I'm a fanboy, but he was very vocal on the subject of we have to have a free press and everything. But most of the others have found reasons to go after their enemies in various ways. But and you talk a little bit about this in the book, but the inconsistency of the left, which would so many of these participated or were cheering on the kind of censorship that went on, the violations of civil liberties under FDR. The 50s came around, and you have the House Un-American Activities Committee, which had existed before, but they were maybe it was more welcome when they were going after anarchists or whatever. But suddenly that and Joe McCarthy suddenly the left acted completely differently. Then they were all about. I mean, I thought it was hilarious when I think it was Trump mentioned the Fifth Amendment or something, and I grew up hearing the left. The Fifth Amendment was sacred to them because all those alleged communists said, "I plead the Fifth," and of course the right made fun of them. Why are you pleading the Fifth? And the left did the exact same thing with Trump and them. Well, why is it plead the Fifth? And there's such inconsistency there. It's like you either believe in the Bill of Rights or you don't, and you believe people have freedom of speech or you don't. But to me, the left acted just like they completely spun on an axis and were in exact opposite positions, suddenly going for freedom of speech in the 50s. And you can't blacklist people. You can't ruin their careers. And they had done the exact same thing or cheered it on in the 1930s.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I see some of that on the right as well, but probably more on the left during this period because they're sort of in charge in some sense. But the Communist Party was just incredibly shameless, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was really one of the first sedition prosecutions during the war was of the Socialist Workers' Party, which was their Marxist Leninists, right? They're Trotskyites. And the Communist Party was all for prosecuting them on these bogus charges of sedition. And then there was the trial of these right-wingers, the Great Sedition Trial of 1944, Father Coughlin. In fact, the communists, if you read the Daily Worker, they wanted to prosecute they really wanted to go after the big fish. They wanted to have the publisher of the Chicago Tribune and the New York Daily News. They wanted to have them thrown in jail. Yeah. They thought, oh, Coughlin, yeah, whatever. We want to go after the big fish. Sounds very familiar with what you see now, right? We want to get the big guy. These small fry we don't care about. And so they're just totally inconsistent. And then, of course, what almost immediately happens once the war is over with is you got new sedition trials ramping up, this time aimed at the communists, and suddenly they're trotting out these First Amendment defenses. And the ones I really like are the people that you see a few who are pretty consistent. Norman Thomas is one. Thurgood Marshall was one, believe it or not. You see some people that are pretty consistent in defending free speech across the board. And those people, I would like their stories to be more emphasized and be told. But there are some heroes here. There are people that pushed back against FDR. That's why things weren't a lot worse. There were people in the federal government that opposed the internment, like FDR's own attorney general. People would say he somehow had to do it. Well, his attorney general didn't think so. The J. Edgar Hoover didn't think so. So that argument doesn't work. I show that FDR is the guy initiating these things very often. And internment is one key example of that. He's leading the charge. It doesn't have to happen. He makes it happen.
Oh, absolutely. He was a powerful figure. He was, there are always people, that are controlling things. I think about of the scenes many times, but FDR was he was not an easy one to control. So I think if things were happening there, what did he say? One of his great statements in the conspiracy world, we love to quote him. He said, nothing happens by accident in politics. But if it happened, you can bet it was planned that way. And he should know. I would think he's one of the all-time greats, I think. In that
he's
respect.
A hands-on guy.
Yeah.
He's something of a micromanager on these things. He's always swooping in and saying to his attorney general, can't you prosecute this guy? What about this person? Why don't you do something about this? His attorney general, Biddle, is constantly complaining that Roosevelt keeps harassing him. Why didn't you prosecute the publisher of the Chicago Tribune? What about Charles Lindbergh? Why don't you go after him? And unfortunately, Biddle has some civil liberties sensibility and is able to hold him off a bit. But no thanks to FDR.
Is there one incredible fact or something that when you were researching this book that you discovered that shocked you, or maybe really hit home what you were trying to write about? What was, when you were researching this, what did you come up with that maybe surprised you or maybe demonstrated the point that you're trying to make in this book?
Probably the most spectacular was the mass surveillance of the Black committee with millions of private telegrams, and
Yeah.
but there was a little newspaper during the war that I came to really think it told an important part of the story, and it's sort of been forgotten. It was one of these handful of papers that saw its mailing rights revoked. And it was only a handful of papers because there were so few people that were against the war. And it was called the Boise Valley Herald. It was a little small town newspaper in Middleton. So they were like, the other ones were like Nazi papers. And this one, I said, let's look this up. And so I got a microfilm of it. It's not on newspaperarchive.com. I got a microfilm. Maybe it's the only one out there. I don't know. And went through this thing. And what it was is a kind of a libertarian paper, in a way. I don't know if you'd call it libertarian, but they were anti-New Deal. They were pro-civil liberties. They were anti-war. And it was run by this family called the Cornell family. And they would republish stuff from the NAACP. They were critical of Japanese internment. And it's like this is incredible. And all those guys' sons went to jail for refusing to register for the draft. So he was an interesting character. And why did the federal government prosecute a paper that maybe had a few hundred subscribers, if that, in a small town of Middleton, Idaho? Why did the government go after that? And it was an interesting question. I still haven't answered it. But I think the reason is because they weren't just willing to go along, right? They remained critical of Roosevelt's foreign policy. They weren't willing, the guy's sons went to jail for refusing to register. But there was no anti-Semitism. It was a regular small town newspaper, but it was targeted by the administration. So I did a little article on it. And I don't know how surprising it is, but it was indicative, sort of a certain attitude, because the government would take certain quotations out of the paper out of context. Like the paper had a thing where it praised Japanese culture, right? And it makes it sound like they were defending Imperial Japan. Then you get the actual news article from the paper, and it's about two Japanese American women that were driving a car and pulled over by policemen in Idaho. And the guy said, well, why didn't you pull over? Imagine saying that to a policeman now. It says, well, we're Americans. We're not doing anything wrong. And then you let him go, right? And this guy, the editor of the paper, said, this is the spirit of resistance that we need in this country. Our Japanese American citizens have it, apparently. Some of them do. And it was taken out of context as some sort of praise for Imperial Japan. But anyway, I like this guy's reputation to be brought back again. But it was indicative, I think, of how desperate the government was to find somebody to prosecute, because just about everybody was supporting the war by this time. And Roosevelt simply could not get backing from his own Justice Department to start prosecuting people like Lindbergh, who had opposed the war before Pearl Harbor. Yeah. Because now they were supporting it. So what do you do? World War I is different. A lot of people were still against that. That's why you have more prosecutions. They remained against it. But after Pearl Harbor, everybody's on board. Even, so who do you have left to prosecute, right?
Yeah, no, and that's why it's incredible that Peter was able to find that information, that many, it was a surprise to you that 16,000 people. I thought, because I knew about World War I, and I thought that the message was drummed home there that, hey, we're going to throw you in jail if you oppose these wars. But World War II, there apparently were more people than I thought, and we'll have a lot of that in the book. But so when you set out to write this book, because we're going to wind down here in a minute, but did you have the premise? Did you have an awareness that FDR had violated civil liberties, or did you just discover all this doing research that it just reinforced what you already knew?
This was sort of well known, and certainly the Japanese internment. And originally, when I did the book, everybody knows about that. Nobody defends it anymore. Very few people, right? But they excuse FDR, though. That's an interesting story. And originally, I wasn't even going to write about the internment because I said everybody knows about that. Let's look at his other civil liberties, his civil liberties record. I knew about the sedition trial, but I looked more and more into it, and I found it was an atrocious record. But then someone said, you've got to write about Japanese internment. And I finally relented. It took an extra 2 years, but I'm glad I did it. because I found out how Japanese internment was interconnected with these other policies. I also found out that FDR was very much taking the initiative on Japanese internment. It was his baby to a great extent. It is not usually portrayed that way in the history books.
Yeah. Yeah. They tried to make it. This is a favored president. He's ranked, near the top in every presidential ranking still. And so I want you to close with how. And did I miss anything? Any other points you want to bring up about the book that people should know? And then tell us where people can reach you and any links you have where they can get the book.
I think we covered it. We covered it pretty well. Again, the book. One thing I will say about that I think people might find it interesting is I find sometimes people say, well, Roosevelt himself said, I used to be Dr. New Deal. Now I'm Dr. Win the War. I'm putting a new hat on. What I find is there's an interconnection between the New Deal and Japanese internment. For example, the WPA, its leading project before it shuts down is Japanese internment, building the camps. The camps are staffed by former WPA people. So that was interesting to me. If you want to find the book, you just go the New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights. You find it on Amazon. You can order the book through Independent Institute, independent.org. If you want to reach me, you can just look up University of Alabama and find me there. My contact information. If anybody wants to write me, just let me know, and you let me know, and I'll give them the information. Be happy to correspond with people about this.
Well, appreciate it.
And I thank you for letting me come on the show.
Well, thanks for coming on, and good luck with the book. And anything I support. I'm a civil libertarian, so you're doing some good work there when you're trying to expose just another dark chapter in history, and it shows again that this is kind of a pattern here. That people in power just tend to want to shut down civil liberties, and thus we need more civil libertarians.
Well, let me say real briefly that there's some positive things about my book, because it shows that there were people willing to defend civil liberties, much more so then than now, I think, and we're willing to push back. So it has some I find them inspiring examples that we can learn from of people defending civil liberties of people they disagree with, much more so then than now.
So. Now that again, this is the left I came from is dead. I don't know where they are in terms of being anti-war, in terms of setting up for civil liberty. They don't exist. I mean, they just don't. They're authoritarians, and they want to. At one time, the left was. That's why I gravitated to them. They wanted to fight for people's rights who didn't have them or wanted to protect them, and now they seem to want to take rights away, and they seem to want to. Put people in prison or prosecute them for things they say if they don't like it. I mean, I don't get it. I think the focus of the left is, and I think a lot of the leftists from the past, the William O. Douglases and people like that, I think they would be shocked to see I don't know what they would be, but I don't think they'd be in today's Democratic Party. I don't know what your view on that is.
Yeah, and I think that maybe things are sort of, in a lot for when the book came out, I was getting. A lot of conservatives were liking what I'm saying. Now I'm not so sure because of what's happened with the war in Gaza. And certainly, I think what Hamas did was horrible. And I'm not a defender of Hamas or anything like it. But I'm getting a little concerned now that a lot of people are suddenly losing their interest in civil liberties on the right. And it always seemed like it was fair weather friends of civil liberties, and that's the way it is on both sides.
It is. You're right. That's why I have some connections on the far right, and they're good. But once it comes to terrorism or something, then they lose all perspective at all. Well, everybody's a terrorist, like everybody's a communist, everybody's a Nazi.
There's no nuance.
Nothing
in between.
No,
right? You're good and evil. Okay.
And that's why as a little kid. I think my political philosophy was formed by, reading about the War for Independence and the founding fathers. I just gravitated to it. Patrick Henry's, who we got from Voltaire, but, saying, I may not agree with you with what you say, but I'll stand up to my dying day for your right to say it. And I've always had that, and I still do. So, unfortunately, there aren't many people around today that that have that. So it's not easy being a civil libertarian. So, it's wonderful having you on the show and knowing people like you are out there. Do you have any before you go? Do you have any ideas for your next book?
Well, I'm a kind of guy that likes to do different kinds of topics, and I'm going to be writing about probably my next book is going to be on the all black town of not all black, but black controlled town of Mound Bayou, Mississippi, which was really a haven for free speech and civil rights in the 1950s in Mississippi. It had a black mayor, a black police chief, and it was where people like Medgar Evers came out of, and you had people like that were involved in the Emmett Till case, in that investigation of that case, in fighting that injustice, really used Mound Bayou as a base of operations. And it was founded by two ex-slaves of Jefferson Davis's brother. So the town has a really fascinating history. It has aspects of intrigue and Peyton Place to it, and it's got all these other things. So I'm being drawn into that topic because I've done a lot of work on civil rights history before, and this is kind of a spinoff of that.
Well, fantastic. It sounds interesting. And again, thanks, David Beito, for coming on the show. Good luck with your book, The New Deal's War on Civil Rights. Go out and get it. Read it. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye. Okay, that was David Beito. So we'll have like a half an hour here to rant. Lots of stuff going in the news. The chat has picked up a little bit on YouTube. And again, I can't see the Rockfin chat. So if you're over there, I'm not ignoring you. So I'm sorry. Don't think that. See, lots of names are coming in here. Of course, White Wolf, Karen Carpenter. I saw Kat Goya. I saw Rhonda Tate for a while. That was nice seeing Rhonda over here. Sam's Bodie's Tree. William Hale from Australia. Good to see you, William. From the land down under. Karen Carpenter, you were a teacher. A lot of the people I talked to were former teachers. Chris Graves, of course, Peter Seakosh, my two ace researchers that I appreciate very much. So I guess I was writing a Substack earlier today about I haven't published it yet about Trump and Trumpenstein, but I just the more I hear about these trials that Trump is going, it's just, and again, I know it's theater, and that I think he's Trumpenstein, but it's regardless of whether he is what he says he is, which I don't think he is, but either way, this is I know people are paying attention to what this guy's being prosecuted for, and again, I don't think he's ever going to be in any jail or anything, but this is setting a horrible precedent for all of us. The latest one, the fact that he's being prosecuted for inflating the value of his property. Now, as a licensed realtor since 1985, I mean, I've known a whole lot of people that inflated the value of their property. And Freethinker 6559 says, thanks for the show. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching it. Harlan Stonewall says, great guest. Thank you. And I know why somebody asked about Pearl Harbor. I could sense the guy probably wasn't a conspiracy guy. So there's no need to go down some of those roads because I'm not going to get in the debate with him. But he focused on something that was important, and that is the suppression of civil liberties. It always is, and it just showed so many parallels. Thanks, Karen. And it really is, considering what we have today. There's so many. When you see the parallels between shutting down the radio shows and the snail mail of periodicals going out back then, and the canceling of people now, getting them fired from their jobs and having them have their YouTube and Twitter and Facebook accounts be canceled on social media, really, it's the same thing. But anyway, I got off track because I was talking about Trump. And so just to see what this is a horrible precedent to set. And if you just look at, thank you, Peter. I'm glad you thought it was excellent because you're the man on FDR. Freethinker 59 says he's been over Rockfin giving you compliments. Well, yeah, anybody that's giving me compliments over there, I don't care if you're saying bad things about me, but if you're saying good things over there, I'm sorry that I'm missing you. I don't know why. I used to get a link to Rockfin, but I don't anymore. I don't know. So Once in a while, I can do that. Yes, please. Harlan says, check, plug your Rumble, Chris. Plug it here. Let me see. So we're finding that if you're catching like what comments the judges and the prosecutors are making, again, just keep the Trump aspect out of it. This is an American citizen. He may be a fake American citizen. I think he's an actor, but this is the idea that they're prosecuting this guy for something that ridiculous. That opens the door again to they're coming up with a myriad of ways now to prosecute potential political opponents. Because I mean, we've all maybe at one time or another, maybe mistakenly, maybe innocently, thought we something we had was worth more than it really was. And again, something like that it's not the way the marketplace is supposed to work. It's worth whatever someone. That's what conservatives say. It's worth whatever someone will pay you or what. So I don't understand that how that can be criminal. I'd like to know what criminal code he's being tried under. So that's especially when you compare that within the Georgia case where he's being prosecuted for complaining about the results of disputing the results of election. Again, we already, we back in the day, many of us were upset with Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul later. We're not upset, but we question, why don't your supporters are all up in arms. They know you're being robbed, that you really won these primaries and you were screwed over. But now, if you had this precedent, if you had a Pat Buchanan or a Ron Paul running that maybe wasn't controlled opposition and they did try to complain about the obvious fraud involved, and you can prosecute them. You set a precedent. That's why, whether it's Lincoln or FDR, the precedents that we saw Dave was talking about, once you set precedents, then it makes it possible to go after people for the same thing, even though it was a wrong-headed, unconstitutional thing to begin with. So you either have free speech or you don't. You certainly have the right. I mean, that's like what from there. It's a very slippery slope. I mean, as an old sports guy, I was, unfortunately a notoriously bad sport sometimes, and I would always tend to blame the referees and the umpires and all that as a player and a coach. But could that be criminal? I don't know. I mean, because it's the same thing, isn't it? Are you questioning the integrity of the officials? It's very, very, it's very slippery slope. So I think I'm disturbed by that, especially in a state where, in Georgia, where if I'm Trump's lawyer, and of course I know his lawyers won't do this because he hires only the worst attorneys on earth, I would just show video clips of Stacey Abrams complaining nonstop about being robbed in the same state. That trial is over. Their star witness defended Trump. No, but well, we'll see. We'll see. And I know the Trump defenders are saying Trump is winning. I haven't seen him win anything. The rules are being thrown out the window, Karen. Absolutely, Karen. This is jurisprudence is being completely rewritten because now you're making it possible these were not crimes. It was never a crime to protest the results of an election. This is amazing that this is being criminalized. Certainly, it wasn't a crime before to protest I mean, even if you could maybe it could be like a misdemeanor fraud if you exaggerated your wealth to get a loan. I mean, is that a criminal offense, really? I don't know, but maybe we all used to kind of fudge that. I remember in real estate, especially when interest rates were high, we would try to circumvent ways because we wanted people to qualify to try to get them in there. And I wasn't a loan officer, but I know loan officers did all they could. So, I mean, are you going to go back to 2008? Because we know there were lots of loans given to people that really didn't qualify for them. Are you going to try all those loan officers? I don't know. I don't think that's. I don't think that's obviously something that we should be doing. The jails are already too crowded now, and I hate to see Trump used as a symbol to make them more crowded because you already have the political prisoners in Washington, D.C., the January 6 people that are that he's not talking about. They're there because of him, but it's shameful. And now they're calling him the head insurrectionist and stuff. It's just, this is just so wrongheaded. It's just, it really is. White Wolf says it's being the bombing of Gaza is where we have no idea. White Wolf, we know they're lying to us. So you say that, some people think none of it's happening. I mean, who knows? We know we're being lied. Harlan Stovall says the real question is who is not inflated there. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Is that everybody, if you've ever dealt with a FSBO or for sale by owner as a realtor, you can talk to people, because anybody that's going to sell it by themselves has an idea what it's worth, and it's always more than market value. So this is ridiculous. But I mean, are those people criminal? It's ridiculous. But White Wolf says it becomes more and more like the USSR. Absolutely. And one way we're worse than the FDR was USSR. Seven, lots of ways, but right now we have a lower turnover rate in Congress, and have for the last several decades, like 96% or something like that of incumbents are reelected every election. And that's a really sad indictment if there is no vote fraud. If there's vote fraud, it explains it. If there is no vote fraud, what does that say about the stupidity of the American voters? But the average American voter. But that's a higher rate, a lower rate of turnover than at the height of the Soviet Union and the Politburo. Think about that. And that ought to make you cringe, but it doesn't. You'll still have these idiots going out here and go rock the vote. And, people, most of the time a lot of times I can't even vote against my representative because they're usually entrenched and they have no opponent. Now, I don't think there's anything sadder or more ridiculous than watching someone talking about what a great democracy you have, trudging off to the polls to cast a vote for a candidate that has no opposition, not even the loyal opposition to the fake two-party system. So many candidates run unopposed. People can't imagine it. It's ridiculous. Wait, what says selling somebody's not a crime. Somebody's dumb and overpay this. Exactly. I mean, I've been ripped off before. I've never knowingly ripped anybody off, but maybe they thought I had. I don't know. But, I remember I bought a van once for a guy who I just found out died not that recently. So I felt bad, but he was in high school with me, and somehow I ended up answering his ad. But nice van. But the air conditioner wasn't working. And I'm too trusting. He said, it just needs Freon. So it was a good deal, but it was a good deal because the air conditioning was broke. So I took it, and I didn't want to pay. It would have cost like $1,500 just for them to analyze what was wrong. There's no reason so we just did without air conditioning. That sucked. But that guy, I'm sure, knew it. But but I mean, was it criminal? No, I don't know. I don't think so. Let me see. Patriots in control, 40 chess. Yeah, that's right, Harlan said. The Patriots in control. We're 2 more weeks. That's what we have now. I don't know what is Q saying now. Is Q? Are they still having the nerve to make predictions at this point? I don't know. Oh yes, Sam's what do you? Thanks for bringing. I wanted to bring that up. It's this MAGA Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who Matt Gaetz is really high on, and I saw a couple of video clips of him just really grilling Mayorkas and Christopher Wray. Sounded great, but here he comes out and he's saying, I knew he had to be an Israeli. I mean, I don't think there is anybody in Congress outside of the squad, maybe, that is not, doesn't stand with Israel, no matter. So I knew he was going to be that. But to come out and say we got it, and that's why I don't understand Matt Gaetz. I don't think Matt Gaetz supports the money to Ukraine. So why is he talking up this guy? Maybe he thought that's the best he could get, that he's good on some issues. But yeah, that was very distressing to know he's saying we can't abandon Ukraine and let Vladimir Putin, it's just ridiculous. Karen Carpenter says she's going to dog night at the ball. Yeah, that's nice. I don't know if my dog Riley can handle that or not, but she's over here. Maybe she'll make an appearance as she comes around, but she's a little camera shy. Deborah Wheeler, I don't see in the chat room. That's her number 1 fan. So hopefully Deborah is listening. But anyway, so that's that's what I'm focused on, these trials. And again, I because I'm part of the smallest minority group in the world, the Trump agnostics. I'm not vested in this guy. I'm not emotionally committed to this. I think pretty much, probably over 300 million Americans are invested in this guy with either love or hate. They either irrationally hate this guy, or they have Trump derangement syndrome, and it's a real thing, or they have Trump enablement syndrome, I call it, where they just, no matter what he does, they continue to believe he's playing 4D chess and 2 more weeks and everybody's really in control. It's madness. But I think I see it for what it is. That's the Trumpenstein Project, where he is being used to not only to divide the country, but now through these. Just think about it. No ex-president had ever been prosecuted for anything. And what are Trump's crimes? And he's going to be prosecuted again. This guy, this psycho, what's his name? Jack Smith, I think it is, or something. This guy he belongs in a padded room somewhere. He's an absolute. I tremble at the prospect of being prosecuted by somebody like this guy. This guy. So I used to say, like, the worst that would be prosecuted by somebody like Nancy Grace, if you remember. She's another nut that belongs in a padded. So this is a woman that is going to get a hold of you like a attack dog and doesn't care about evidence. You're going to prison. I will lock you up. This guy's the same way. Looks like an ex-hippie, and is just he was lectured by the Supreme Court before the Trump Supreme Court, a more liberal Supreme Court in 2016. He was lectured about as a prosecutor for the Justice Department before he became special counsel. He was lectured about the way he was trying to see criminality everywhere. And so the guy wants to prosecute everybody. If you look at his tweet, I went to his Twitter feed and just look at he's just like Trump. He's not, he may be a little more articulate, but he attacks the Republicans and attacks Trump and his family in such a childish, immature way. It's just shocking. And this guy, 37 counts against him. And okay, Chris, I did follow you on Rumble. Please help out my friend Chris Graves. Rhonda hates us. She's followed too. And follow him there. Support him. We all need to support each other, because you see what we're up against. This is, and again, all of you out there, don't think that. I was talking to my neighbor, who's one of the few Wake neighbors I have. He's a big InfoWars fan, so he's excited. And I hope all you saw me on the War Room Wednesday with Harrison Smith, who's a really nice guy. So hopefully that'll open the door up to me for InfoWars again, because I need to get more people, especially talking about masking the truth. That's what we talked about there. And I'm just looking at the comments in the chat. But so hopefully people, checked it out there. But it's a very scary prospect, because I was telling my neighbor to think that, there used to be expression, walk a mile in my moccasins, stand in somebody's shoes, there for the grace of God go I. That expression's, again, people know nothing anymore, and there's no empathy left in society, so don't think of that. I look at Trump and Alex Jones and Owen Schroyer and all the January 6th defendants, regardless of how many, especially with Jones and Trump, okay, people think, okay, they're part of it, whatever. But I'm terrified at the prospect of going, because I know being charged with some guy, especially there aren't crime. I'm a goody two shoes in terms of I don't break any laws, but because they're expanding what laws are, if you start allowing thought crimes in, and that's what basically all this is, we're all thought criminals, and you have no choice to defend yourself. And if you're going into these courtrooms, you look at these judges. Look at Roger Stone's judge, Amy Berman Jackson. Look at all the judges Alex Jones had and Trump had. They're basically just publicly declaring them guilty before the trial even begins, and things that you would have never heard anybody say. Harlan says the Q-tards are mad at General Flynn for he was their hero for a while, right? And I don't know if our boy Gary McBride is listening. That's General Flynn's aide or something who's got a hold of him. Gary, if you're listening out there, I'd like to know. That's the kind of things that bother me, because Gary was helped by a lot of people here, including me, when nobody knew who he was. And I don't know what he's doing now, but I tried to get Ashley Babbitt's mom back on the show. I got through him, and she's not answering me either. So Karen Carpenter says Nancy Grace. Yeah, Nancy Grace was why I used to, some of these true crimes things used to interest me. And I used to watch her show sometimes, especially Natalie Holloway. And and by the way, I can't talk about it, but I have inside knowledge on it. And people know about me. One day, maybe I'll publish a book on the Natalie Holloway case. I've been working with people who have the inside scoop on that. And just suffice to say, I don't think that Joran Vandersloot killed Natalie Holloway. I don't think he killed the girl in Peru. There's a lot of psyop elements there, a lot of lies. And so it's a fascinating story if I ever read. But I was watching her friend John Benet Ramsey's another one that I don't know why I got, attracted to those two cases. They just hit me over the head with it. And in both cases, it seemed like in the Natalie Holloway case, it was watching the interviews with the mother and the students. I just thought, why are they smiling? It was before Sandy Hook. And I said, why are they smiling at that? They don't seem, this doesn't seem to make sense. And so I started, checking up on it and doing some research. And then I met these people. Same thing with John Benet Ramsey. It just seemed like the mother was off. Their story made no sense. There could not have been an intruder. It's impossible. So trying to figure out the dynamics there. So I was watching those shows, and I just always found, how did Nancy Grace, first of all, just that look she gets on her face. It's wow. And they say like her fiance was killed or something, and that turned her, as a young woman, against, but that doesn't mean everybody's guilty. Okay. I felt bad for that, but come on. I mean, it's just, she has no respect for civil liberties. Chris Early says, I get, John, that's right. Thank you. Good to see you, Chris Early. John will be on the rents tonight. Yeah. Oh, signed Georgia Ann. Okay. Is that Georgia Ann or is it Chris Early? But yeah, he's going to be on there. I should mention it. Yeah, it's always fun when he's on there. John is you never know what he's going to talk about. You get John and he's going to give you some variation of JFK and the showbiz career or something like that. But it's always interesting. He's just a treasure. 90 years old, enthusiasm, a teenager. I just cherish his friendship. White Wolf says he's praying over the political situation. Not going to be able to vote harder, but we can certainly pray. That's absolutely right. We can't do that. Karen Carpenter says, yeah, we're toast. The thoughts are right. And there's so many. The thoughts are a crime. There's so many Americans that that I think that like they came out with the thing that says, you can read your thoughts. A machine. As you said, I mean, I don't know if I'm like everybody else, but thoughts go through my mind just almost unconsciously, and I'm not proud of many of them. I don't want. I certainly don't want people. I don't want people closest to me knowing that. And I don't know what I'd think if I discovered, bad or some kind of crazy thoughts going through people that I know real well. So it's very important to have that. But so thought crime is basically, it's not to that level, but it could get there because so many people, again, I think are just unconcerned about this. And I say, yeah, if you got Chris Early says Vandersloot confessed. No, Chris, I wish I could talk about that, but I can't. I'm basically tied by a gag order, if you will, but I can't. But let's just say it wasn't a legitimate confession. But the evidence, and if we ever have that book, basically we have people on on tape admitting that I think he got him on tape. Yeah, that that she came back to the Holiday Inn that night after she left Vandersloot. So that exculpates him because his movements are accounted for after that. And in terms of the murder in Peru, I have an email from some Dutch journalists that verified what I knew, what I suspected and knew. That was, if you remember, they kept showing a picture of him going out of the room and walking into the room with the girl. And I remember thinking, well, this is a Fleabag motel in Peru. Would they really have security cameras? So sure enough, that security camera outside his room was installed right before he got there. And they put him in that room for a reason. The FBI was trying to do a sting on him. And they took the camera out after he left. So I have that from reputable Dutch journalists that said that there's so much to that story. And again, I don't even understand that one, to be honest with you. In the John Benet Ramsey case, I can understand it's a very wealthy family. So they're going to be given the benefit of the doubt. Let's face it, if your child is found dead in your home and there's a ridiculous rambling ransom note where at the same place, a location of the body, which makes the ransom note pointless, as I think one of the people investigators said, there's never been a case of a ransom note being found at the same location of a dead body. If that's a poor or even middle class house, parents are gone. They're arrested right away. That's probable cause. So I can understand that that's wealth, but in the case of Natalie Holloway, I don't understand. There doesn't seem to be a political reason for it, but it's the same kind of elements there that I find in all these other things. So hopefully because I know that would be a big bestseller because I get people all the time are very interested in that. But it is what it is. My hands are kind of tied there. What was the thought's been a thought crime for a long time? You were against evolution in college. That was a crime. Yeah. Well, more and more of us are boldly coming out as against evolution now. It's not as it's not as unpopular now. Barber's great. Our political views don't see, but back in the day, he and I don't agree about everything, but John is we can disagree amicably, and he's the best. Chris said, I think someone hid in the home until they went to sleep. Well, I'll have to maybe one day. If I care enough, I'd write a book about that. But the problem, in both those cases, you got to be very careful because they're very litigious. And ironically, the attorney for the Ramseys for a long time was Lynn Wood, back when he was Perry Mason, before he became whatever he is now, part of Donald Trump's most incredibly inept legal team. Yes, and in fact, I had a person interested back in the day. We had because we actually, and again, I'm beholden to the research of these people, but we were going to try to get this book published on Natalie Holloway. And I had a publisher interested, but they wouldn't guarantee that they would not guarantee that that they would protect me legally. Because I said, look, you're not a big publisher. I don't want to be sued by these people. And I'm not making, all I do is I quote official reports, statements, direct quotes, but I know how litigious they are. I said, I don't want, and remember, Natalie Holloway's mom, Beth, and John Benet Ramsey's father, John, were dating for a while, which was kind of appropriate, I guess. But so that's why that book never got done. So it's on to, other things. So right now I've started working on what is basically Hidden History 4, but the Pipe the Bimbo in Red is coming out officially. It's out there now for pre-sale if you want to check that out. It's Pipe the Bimbo in Red. Dean Andros, Jim Garrison, and the Conspiracy to Kill JFK, written with my buddy William Law, one of the probably the preeminent expert on the medical evidence of JFK case, very underrated researcher. Interesting story, and it has a lot to do with my longtime friendship with Dean Andrews III, son of the New Orleans beatnik lawyer that was played by John Candy in Oliver Stone's JFK so memorably. And Dean was my brother's best friend. I came to know him through them, and so it's kind of a weird story. Became friends of the family at many party gatherings, so this is kind of a cool thing for all of us. So check that out, Pipe the Bimbo in Red. Interesting title. And then The American Memory Hole, How the Court Historians Promote Disinformation, which is basically Hidden History 3. That's really, I think, maybe my most impressive work so far. And it has, I have Peter C. Koch and Chris Graves to thank for a lot of that. They did a lot of great work. But so that'll be coming out next spring. So always busy. In the meantime, please, if you can, if you're not subscribed to me on Substack, please do so. DonaldJeffries.substack.com. I protest just like the show. I write there regularly. It's the only place I'm not shadow banned. Follow me at Don Jeffries on Twitter if you can do that. We have to try to support each other. As I said, support Chris Graves on Rumble. Support all these other shows that are about Angry Tiger and the people that are in the chat now. White Wolf says he wants to demonstrate. Yeah, I didn't ask him a question about Pearl Harbor because I suspect somehow, White Wolf, that he doesn't think Roosevelt knew. But you certainly, I have a lot about that in Crimes and Cover-Ups, and there's no question. He absolutely had advanced knowledge of it. No question about it. So at any rate, we're just about out of time. It's good to see you guys in the chat. Chris Graves says, thanks, Don. Thank you. And thanks, everybody, for participating. Check us out tomorrow on America Unplugged, 12 noon, with the great Tony Arterburn, great Billy Ray Valentine. And again, check me out on Substack, DonaldJeffries.substack.com. If you can, please try to rate. You don't even have to write a review. Try to rate Masking the Truth. I'm trying to figure out what they're doing there because I've had several people tell me that they reviewed it and they just didn't put the review up on Amazon. We need numbers, and I don't know how we're going to do that otherwise. And so please, Masking the Truth, try to get in your library. Some of you have been successful. We just have to keep hitting at them to break down their algorithm. Please suggest Masking the Truth for your libraries. And obviously the people who bought it, I very much appreciate that. But at any rate, I guess I'll close this out as Tony's probably busy with his customers. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And we'll see you next week, same time. I protest. Take care.